Cool. I think that we're fine to start. So thank you everyone for coming. Very impressed considering the weather and how the day has been, the amount of people we have here, and it's really, really great because it kind of shows how much interest there is in these topics. We put them together today. We're going to be talking about hedges and riparian buffers because we think that people usually think of them almost like a continuum. So it's a good opportunity to highlight the differences between them, but also if you have any questions that you think could be addressed by both sides of the spectrum, we would love to try to answer them. And if it doesn't, we don't have the answers now, to answer them later through the follow-up emails. A little bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded because the idea is to put it up online afterwards. So being recorded, please turn your cameras off. But also if you know someone that wasn't able to make it and would be interested, we'll be sharing the link probably in the coming week so that people can see it. Feel free to ask as many questions as you want. Feel free to just put them in the chat and we'll be picking them. And if you have sort of like small conversations that you want to have with other people, use the chat. The chat's a space for you guys to sort of like just let your heart loose and ask any questions and just feel free to use it as much as you want to. We're going to start with 15 minutes each. We're going to start with Helen, who's going to be talking about her experience in a croft in the Isle of Mull and why and how she's planted hedges there. Then we're going to move to champion hedgelayer Torquil, who had not told me that he was a champion hedgelayer, and then I found it online, to explain what hedge laying is and why it's important and why the relevance. And then we're going to move in the farm and go towards the river, and we're going to get Russ and Craig to talk a little bit more about why riparian buffers are important. And while Russ is going to be talking about what's happening above water, Craig's going to be focusing on why the importance for everything in the river. So it's a very full-on night. We're going to have probably a lot of time, so we're just going to get started. I think that's it. Lawrence, the mic is on. So Lawrence, if you can mute yourself, that'd be amazing.
I'm trying to hear about you.
Don't worry, I'll give you a hand with this. There we go. So we're gonna just get started with Helen. Helen,
yes.
Ready to start?
Yes, sure.
So we're gonna start with a few questions, but just for you to have an idea of how brilliant the place where Helen is, I'm gonna share a few images that she sent. Don't worry, people, this is not going to be murdered by PowerPoint. We've prepared our guests just to have conversations. So if you can even just be listening to what we're saying and you should be fine. But Helen, because she's going to be talking about the place where she is, we thought it would be a good idea to have a few images. So while I put it up, Helen, would you like to start by telling us a little bit about where you are and why the hedges, and make sure to show the images that will show very clearly why the hedges.
Okay, right. So a few years ago, we bought a bareland croft on the Isle of Mull, and that is off the west coast of Argyll, Oban, for anybody who doesn't know where Mull is. And we bought this croft, which looks east up Loch Screeden, which is the bit on towards the right half of the picture, and north up to Loch Nakeal and everything, all stations north. So it's a bit difficult to tell from this picture, which was taken a couple of years ago, but the land is very exposed to the sea. We're only about 10 meters above sea level. We have a cliff at one point and we run down to the sea on shingles at others. And we get blasted by winds from the east and from the north, which are very cold, with absolutely no shelter at all. And from that picture that you can see, the little white dots are our sheep. And we felt that this was a bit sort of sad for the sheep, that they'd got nowhere to sort of shelter from these cold winds and driving rain. And we thought that it might be an idea to plant some hedges that they could tuck themselves behind. So that's where we started. That's where we came from.
It's also just not to give you the opportunity to talk about bees, please control yourself. But I understand that it's also the bees that you were thinking of when you were putting some of them there.
Yes,
This is a more exposed picture.
we have
that's a good idea, just to show how little shelter there is when you're on land.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, that's before we managed to start putting any fencing or hedging or anything up. That's just a tumble down wall that had at some stage had a bit of a post and wire fence against it as well. And so we had quite a bit of work to do to make the fields into stock proof. But as you can see, there's a lot of bracken and stuff like that. And I'm a beekeeper, been keeping bees for about 20 years. And was very keen to make sure that there was plenty of flowers for the bees as well. So I looked in my hedges to also make sure that there were some flowering plants going in them. So as well as the windbreaks, I was also wanting forage for the bees.
So how did you start the process? Was it you get an idea in your head that hedges are a good idea, and how do you even start going around about it? Like it's do you start looking online? Did you know someone who had them? How was the process there?
Well, I suppose I'd been a gardener for about 20 years, and I'd also we'd moved here from Lancashire, and we used to live about 850 feet above sea level in Lancashire, so we were quite used to cold, windy places, and we'd planted trees around the small holding that we had there, and found that they made a big impact on the sort of forage and environment there, and they grew quite well. So it was always in the back of my mind, and I did initially start just buying plants myself and popping them along the field boundaries. But I can't remember exactly where it was, but it must have been at some event or other on the island. I came across Iona from the Woodland Trust, and she was talking about the help and grants and experience and advice that they could give. And so I got in touch with her, and she came down, and she was quite enthusiastic about helping us and came up with some ideas about where we could plant hedges and where we could widen the areas and make them into sort of like mini woodland areas. And we just took it from there. We just worked through it.
That sounds really cool. Just for everyone to know, we're going to be sharing Iona's info. She couldn't make it today, but she's more than happy to get any questions and answer them. So how was the process once you knew that it was Iona, and how do you do it? Is it an easy process? Is it a complicated process? And how also do you decide which are good areas or bad areas? What was the criteria to decide where to plant them? I think there's a little map over here, isn't there?
Yeah, so this is mainly the sort of middle section of the of that plan, shows the brown lines where we put the hedges, and then the hashed areas of the wider areas that are woodland. For example, up on the left hand side where it says 0.02 hectares, and it's a little rectangle and it's hatched between two brown lines where it says 60 meters. That's on a very steep bit below the barn, very rocky, wasn't much use for forage or access, and it just seemed sort of logical to fence it off, stop the sheep being able to get at the trees and plant something in there. Also, I thought it might screen the barn a bit, because where it says 30 meters and a little arrow, that square behind it is supposed to represent a house, somebody's home. And there's another little square up above, that's somebody else's house. And I did things that I thought might sort of make it a bit prettier, because it wasn't the prettiest barn that you could ever hope to look at. But other than that, it was just along the edges of the fields and bits of ground which weren't much use for the sheep to graze, where or where you couldn't mow for making hay or anything like that. That was the logic.
How long has it been since you've had it? Has it been 4 years, I think, or 3 years that you planted them?
I think it's about that time, yes. I've forgotten the date when we actually completed it. It was quite a long, drawn-out process, but I think that's probably was due to time constraints on, you know, the Woodland Trust, how many people that they were dealing with, and, you know, physically being able to get round everybody. But it wasn't a big issue, really. I wasn't sort of drumming my heels in frustration waiting for the trees to arrive. There was a lot of discussion coming up with ideas of what plants to plant, and Iona's expertise really helping us with choosing things that would be good for the environment. Because
so well, you don't need to be an expert to begin with to start the process. You don't really need to be an expert to begin with to start the process.
Oh, no. I mean, I'm very much an amateur, and very much an amateur crofter, and very much an amateur gardener.
All of them in one. So how has been the process since you planted them? Or how, like, okay, you were sitting there, eventually the trees come, they're in your door, at your door. How do you do that from there? How do you continue the process?
You panic because the trees arrive at absolutely the wrong time for my purposes. That they came at what I would really feel was the end of the planting season. It was the end of the winter, and there was about, well, in theory there was about 2,800 plants arrived, but in fact there was some extras in the mix, and it was spring came with a vengeance. And we just healed them in up in the garden of the house, and then would pick up a batch and a spade and start getting them planted properly, but keeping them sort of moist. It was good fun. We planted them at the beginning of a drought. And so I was, as well as planting, I was also trying to keep them watered as well, which was hard work. But
I can imagine that sounds pretty intense.
Friends and neighbours all got dragged into the mix.
Just for everyone to have an idea, not only were you planting lots of trees, but this is all the amounts, like different species and kind of trees and shrubs that were being planted, so you can have an idea of how varied they can be and how varied the whole process can be. So that's really, really good. The next question that I wanted to ask you is about sort of like how has the process been from there? So you planted them, you managed to get them alive and managed to get them to the end of a process. So what happens then?
Then you sort of a bit in the lap of the gods. There have been some losses, I have to admit, and I'm busy sort of trying to replace them and replant and fill the gaps. The biggest problem has been voles that come along and just bite through the bottom of the stem, even though I've got tree guards on, and I've still left all the tree guards on. I've come to the conclusion that where the bracken has grown up around the trees, that the voles have got very safe runs to get around without being predated by the birds of prey. We've got some very good vole catchers around, white-tailed eagles, golden eagles, hen harriers, buzzards, all sorts. But the voles were safe under the bracken, and so they chomped their way through the trees. So we're now busy trying to keep the bracken more stamped down and cut, and so that the voles don't have that nice protected route to get to the trees.
That sounds a bit like lovely. I can imagine how lovely those little animals are running around and how voracious they can be, and like being in the middle of nowhere. So now you're all planted, they're growing. Is it taking longer than you thought it would take for them to grow? Or are you sort of like, were you expecting it to take a couple of years, considering the conditions in the island, which can be brutal?
Yes, I didn't really have too much expectations of them growing quickly. But coming down from the heights of Lancashire, I've actually moved into a warmer area. And,
I like your
we
brook.
used to get sort of snowed in for at least a week at a time every year when we were in Lancashire. We got really good sort of trees growing there, but they are slow growing. The soil is quite poor where we are. The rock is very close to the surface, and we do have much longer winters. So yes, it's just taking longer. They're growing very slowly. I think the one thing that I can say that's interesting that I've noticed is that the trees, there was a lot of alder and a lot of willow that I chose for these particular locations, but where they got planted in damp soil, so we've got some quite boggy fields which you can't see the picture any longer, but the part of the croft is very, very wet. Those have done so much better than anywhere else on the croft. So even, when you think you're in good growing conditions, just having their feet always in the damp soil has really boosted them. And that particular section, that particular field that's got such wet ground, the trees have gone so much faster than anywhere else.
I think that Lynn is somewhere in the shadows here, Lynn from the Scottish Forestry, but I think that this goes to one of her favorite phrases, the right tree in the right place for the right reasons. So that kind of makes an awful lot of sense. What are your expectations now? Because we're going to move from here in a second to the other side of the screen to Torquil, who's going to be talking a little bit more about what happens once you already have a hedge and you have to start managing it. But what are your expectations now that you still have baby trees around, but they're finally growing?
I'm hoping that they will grow to a good thickness. I must confess that I would be interested in laying the hedges once they get big enough and strong enough, and I don't know much about how old the tree or how bigger a sort of trunk it would need to have before you start laying, but I confess to having had one go at laying hedging when we were on a smallholders course, but I do feel that a laid hedge gives so much depth close to the ground, which will give the shelter, and I would love to lay the hawthorn and get that thickness at the bottom. I've seen old hedges that have just been left to get going where they get very straggly, but I think I'm probably digressing into somebody else's patch here.
That's fine. Turk was about to answer all your questions, so you're absolutely covered. And just a final question before we move to Torquil. There's a few questions coming in, but I think we're going to leave them all to the end, and just to make sure that we have everyone talking a little bit. Will you do it again? Would you do it if you had to start again? Would you plant them? Oh,
absolutely. Yeah, there'll be more hedges going in. There'll be more trees going in, whether it's through the Woodland Trust or just out of my own back pocket.
Lucky bees. I think that they're great. Thanks, Helen. We're going to move now to Torquil, but if you can stay around, and people, if you have any questions, feel free to start putting them there. There's a few questions about if you fence the hedges. There's a few questions about whether it was bare roots or not. So keep them in mind. Start planning your answers. And in the meantime, we're going to go to Torquil to sort of like tell us the second part of the life of a hedge, I guess. Torquil, what's hedge laying for people that have heard about it and are not completely sure of what it is, like myself?
So ultimately, hedge laying is about constructing a stock-proof barrier at the end of the day, and that's how it would have been used historically. Before the advent of metal fencing, you would have had a mature hedge anything. In answer to your question, Helen, the height of your existing hedge is really important for what you end up with. So you need to wait until your hedge plants have got up to about 9 or 10 foot high, and that's when they're ready for laying. There's the main reasons for, apart from creating a stock-proof fence, is to create to regenerate life in the bottom of a hedge. If you can let a hawthorn or blackthorn grow until it reaches maturity, ultimately all it's going to do is shade off everything underneath and will eventually get so big that it actually falls down. You can beat this by laying the hedge, and then by maintaining it afterwards. You could go for 50 years before you would need to lay that hedge again if you trimmed it in the right way. So they're essential in terms of the longevity it gives, but just giving the wildlife corridors, I think, are the most important thing. If you are going to be planting a hedge, make sure you give it a big wide area away from fences. It's best to fence them off once they've been laid, but it's not strictly necessary. Historically, you have different styles of hedge laying all across the country, mainly in England. In Scotland, you don't really have specific styles, and it's very hard to change the mentality of farmers. From my experience in Scotland, you say, "Oh, I can lay your hedge for you," and they'll look at you blankly. It's far more accepted in England, and each style is dependent upon the agriculture of that time. In Yorkshire, for example, they would have a three field rotation system. So in the first year, you would lay the hedge. You would then let it go to arable for 2 years, and then by the third year, that hedge that you've laid has now regenerated, sent the shoots up, and they're now, after year 2 and year 3, prickly enough to stop any stock coming and nibbling that hedge. Say, for example, in Wales, where sheep are the predominant animal, you'd be looking to lay the hedge and be able to get those animals into the field at the same year. So they would leave a lot of the brash on the hedge on the side that faces into the field. So yeah, each different style, and there must be probably 15, 16 different styles up and down the country, all done in a certain way. But it all comes from the same central idea of making a cut in the stem, down at the bottom, cleaving it over, and then from that cut stem at the base, that's when you'll get the majority of your regeneration coming up. Which, I mean, some people, you have a lot of wildlife trusts that might get a bit of hedge laying done, but they don't necessarily have the maintenance afterwards. So it's important, once you've got your laid hedge, to decide exactly what you're going to do with it. What's your purpose for it? The standard way I would suggest is probably to do incrementally, raise the level of your hedge every 4 or 5 inches each year. Let it grow a bit. Don't be too harsh in cutting that finished hedge back, because it's sort of, well, what's the point of having it unless you've actually got something substantial there? And it's really important in terms of getting as many different species within that hedgerow mix. When we plant hedges, we're looking to plant a conservation mix of hedges. And I noticed, Helen, that you had some elder in yours. That's an anathema to a hedge layer. They hate elder, and they would always cut it out. And it would probably be the only one that I wouldn't accept within a hedge. They all do really well in a shelter belt, but not in a hedge, because they suck the nutrients away from the hedge plants around them, so it creates gaps within a hedge. But you can lay pretty much anything apart from evergreens. You can lay everything apart from elder. Cut elder out, and you'd probably cut dog rose out as well, because it just comes back so quickly on being coppiced.
So imagine you're a Scottish person, Scottish farmer, crofter, depending on where it is. Somewhere in Scotland in general, you can choose the more, like, I was going to try to think of a place that's sort of like your quintessential Scottish, but so varied. But say you're in this colder climate, your hedges are starting to grow. They've been planted for 4 years. You have no idea how to move forward. When's the moment where you should be saying, hey, I need to sort of like lay it, this is a process, and just get it started with? How would you recommend it?
When the hedge is taller than you are.
All right. Well, I mean,
That's
On a
when
really
you
short
and just leave them. Don't trim them. Just let them grow. If you are looking to get them laid eventually, just don't muck about with them, because trimming them creates scraggly bits, and it makes it harder to lay. So just let them grow until they get about 10 foot high.
Mhm.
There's a good website. It's a National Hedgelaying Society, which you can Google. They've got lots of good information about hedges and also how to find a hedge layer. There's not that many in Scotland, to be honest. I think I'm probably the only one who's actually on their list up in Scotland. But across the country there are plenty of hedge layers.
What are the main mistakes that people make when either deciding to focus on hedge laying or just start doing it? Like, is the main mistake that you shouldn't do it if you don't know how to do it? Like,
yeah,
it sounds silly, but
it's a kind of process where everything is going to grow back eventually. So
Okay.
you can make mistakes, and it can be quite forgiving eventually. A common mistake that people do is if you could imagine the stem of a plant, and they might decide to do what we call a pleach, which is the cut that you make into that stem. Sometimes they can do it too high up. So you've got a tree like that, and they bend it over like that. Whereas what you have to do it from the base.
Mhm.
So that regeneration comes from the base. And that also, if you imagine a line of hedge plants like that, you bend them over like that, then the regeneration comes up. And so it's completely knitted by going that way, and then the regrowth coming up that way as well. These hands are very useful.
I'm loving I speak with my hands, so I'm like, I know exactly what you mean when you do the whole thing.
Yeah.
Danielle actually is anticipating one of the questions that was coming, which is, what are the advantages of hedge laying versus hedge coppicing? What are the advantages, differences? Why would you suggest one over the other? And what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, both are good. At the end of the day, the hedge is established already, so the root system is established. So you're not competing with weeds or anything like that, which is important when you first plant a hedge, to make sure that you have some form of weed control, whether it's through a mat or by physically weeding it in the first couple of years. But the difference is between, usually if you've got a really, really overstood hedge and you've got too much weight on that if it's like a tree, you can still lay it, but actually getting it to come down, it's actually really heavy. You can just about do it, but sometimes you have to chop the top of it and kind of lay logs. So sometimes the quickest way is actually to coppice it completely. But this would depend on what your rabbit situation is like and what the deer situation is like, because that can be a real issue. If you were to coppice it and you're overrun with rabbits, they'll just eat the regrowth and beat it back. But I would always say hedge, if you can lay it, lay it. But coppicing is fine as well, and it will come back quickly, usually.
That makes sense. So where do you think, how could people learn how to do this? Is it something that you have to take a course on? Is it something that you can learn from experience, from watching it somewhere? Because I think that's one of those things that people are terrified of. I mean, I know I would be terrified of it.
I think the best way is to get taught by an accredited hedge layer, to be honest, because it's best practice. Yes, you could Google stuff and you could watch some YouTube videos and you'll get a general idea. But to be honest, it's better within a workshop environment where you've got half a dozen of you. And it's kind of, when I run workshops, I usually get people to work in pairs, which is a good way so that they can be discussing what they're doing, and it's a good way of learning. But I would definitely try and go on a hedge laying course. And to be honest, it's all it takes is one day, and you'll be able to lay a hedge by the end of that day, and you'll be able to take those skills back to whatever farm or small holding you have. But it's a very labor intensive job, hedge laying, and
perfect for winter when otherwise you wouldn't move.
Perfect for winter, absolutely. Yeah.
What would be your top tips then, in terms of not necessarily just the practicalities of it, but also when would you start doing it? Why? Like, what situation you would sort of like say definitely don't do it? Sort of like just those main top tips.
There is a specific season, and it's when the sap is down. So you should be laying hedges from October probably through till March, but you know, the spring is coming earlier and earlier and earlier. So you can lay hedges all year round in theory, but that might muck up birds nesting. And it's a very hot business. You wouldn't want to be hedge laying in the summertime. So definitely do it. It's a winter occupation. You need to think about what materials you would use as well. I use for my hedging stakes, I use coppiced hazel. I've got 2 hazel coppices and a willow coppice around the Angus area, and that's where I get my hedging stakes. And I use binders that go along the top. Now you can use anything as long as it's of a narrow diameter and has got good length on it. They probably need to be about 12 or 15 foot long. And you can use birch, you can use willow withies, you can use hazel. And it binds the top of it. So if you're in an exposed area, so I imagine, Helen, you're quite exposed where you are, that would be something to think about. And it's also quite, if you're planning ahead, if you've got willow, it's a great thing to coppice and use that willow as binders on top of your laid hedge. Failing that, you can get sawnwood from the timber yard, but that's an expense. I would always try and promote coppice craft. And sorry, I'm going to have to cough, I'm afraid.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. So yeah, that's all you really need. A strong pair of gloves is a requirement because the thorns will go through those gloves like butter. I have a leather mitt that I had made, which is sort of good for stuffing the hedge into shape. Welder's gloves is generally what we use. Don't do it in the rain, because you'll slice through your hands. So any other condition is fine. As we had today, we've been laying hedges today, me and 2 other guys at Balcaski Estate near Pitton Weem. And they're very forward-thinking estate, which it's seldom have I seen in Scotland, estates that are willing to actually plant a lot of hedges. So it's great to have connected with them this year, and we're going to lay 1 hedge for them, and then hopefully over the next coming years we'll be laying some more hedges for them as well. But yeah, that
sounds great. Finally, any situation, sort of like tree situation or landscape situation, where you'd say, you know what, better stay away from this hedge laying in this situation?
Not really. No. I mean, we do hedges by roads. It's not the most pleasurable place to work, to be honest, but hedge laying. No, there's nothing I would turn away from. I would question sometimes really mature hedges whether they're better left as they are in certain situations. It depends on the commitment of the organisation to actually follow up what they decide to do with maintenance afterwards, because there's been many examples in the past where we've laid hedges and you know that it's just they're not going to do anything with it. They've had their capital expenditure and they've spent their money on doing this, but they're not really thinking of what's happening in year 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7. But no, nothing
major. Right.
No.
We're gonna move then thank you so much for that. By the way, I noticed, Torquil, that I just assumed that everybody knew who you are. So everyone, Torquil's an expert hedge layer, which I'm assuming that you already know, but also send information, because it's not only that, but he's a champion of it. So what do you mean when you say that you're a champion hedge layer? Can you explain that? I saw it online. Sorry, everyone, this is just me being nosy, but I thought that would be a nice note to finish on.
It's been a few years since I could take that accolade, but no, it's a very niche market, the hedge laying world. They have a national championship held usually down in England, where you get about 130 different hedge layers coming to show off their craft. Within that competition, you would have probably about 12 different styles. So within that, I won a couple of times the Yorkshire part of the competition. So I didn't win the whole thing. I just won one part of it. But
you're a champion in my heart. That's absolutely. So we're going to move from the world of hedges to the world of water and riparian buffers. So I'm gonna let Russ. Were you laughing because you were thinking of a moment of suffering when you were laying hedges or something? At one point, when Torquil was talking about the gloves and everything, you were like, just use them. You're muted. Proceed to unmute yourself, Russ, because we're going to be talking to Russ and Craig now.
All right, sorry about that. Yes, I was just saying I have the scars and had a trip to hospital after some blackthorn incident many years ago. So, yeah, I've been there on them. Well done, Torquil. Great talk, mate. Thank you. Cheers, Helen.
No worries. So again, we're going to move into this. Craig, Russ, do you have any preference of who wants to start talking or what would make sense? Because otherwise I'm just going to go straight to Craig to open our eyes to the wonderful world of why trees are really good for water.
Indeed, yeah, that might be a good idea. So I can talk about the ecological benefits of tree planting, and then maybe Russ could go into some of the more technical aspects of it and how to do it. Is that okay with you, Russ?
Yeah, that's fine. Yep, no bother.
Excellent.
That sounds brilliant. So Craig, I'm gonna start, give the sort of like the floor to you, and just if you could sort of like set the scene about, I think that probably sort of like why trees are important and what the situation is currently. So just go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think that the first thing to bear in mind is that healthy rivers and healthy watercourses really need riparian trees. They're absolutely integral to a healthy watercourse. There's so many different benefits, but the main ones, I think, when it comes to rivers and it comes to the ecology, are to do with shade. They provide shading. We're projecting some temperature increases due to climate change, and we really need to get trees planted now if we're going to mitigate some of the worst effects of these increases in temperature. The trees act as natural flood management techniques. So certainly a lot of the flooding, and this will be very relevant in Cumbria and areas like that, where they saw an awful lot of flooding, a lot of the trees have been taken away. So you can see the impact yourself, and planting lots and lots of trees, especially in the riparian zone, will again help to mitigate some of the effects of severe rainfall. Trees, when they fall into the river, trees provide really important habitat for lots of aquatic organisms, mainly fish, lots of invertebrates. So one of the things I've mentioned a few times now before is that fish grow on trees. And if you like your fish at all, it's really important to bear in mind. So if a tree falls into the river, leave it. Leave it alone. Messy, chaotic is good. I know a lot of farmers, that's anathema to them, but trust me, messy is good. Also, the leaf litter, the leaf litter from trees provides lots of good nutrients to the river. So they break down, so they're good for bacteria, which are then good for the invertebrates, which lots of birds and fish and mammals will then feed on. So there's a whole, it's like the cornerstone really of a healthy ecosystem. And the added benefit as well, with all these roots in the riverbanks, that they can help to protect riverbanks from excess erosion. So for the farmer, if you're in an area where your river's prone to lots of erosion, then you'll see that if you have some trees there, those areas are more stable, and you see much less much reduced rates of erosion. So it does help to protect the riverbank as well. For the water quality, riparian trees are really important as well. So the trees, the tree roots will go down deep into the soil, and they'll trap excess nutrients and pollutants as they're coming off fields, so arable fields, if you've got potato farming or anything like that. The trees you've got to have a proper buffer zone, and the tree roots will stop these harmful nutrients going into the watercourse. So you do see an improvement in water quality. I mentioned before about the tree roots reducing the rates of erosion. There's so many different benefits. It's incredible. I'm
loving this.
When you have lots of erosion of riverbanks, you have lots of silt that enters the watercourse. And what happens is when the silt can smother habitat, they can smother the salmon spawning grounds, trout spawning grounds. They can reduce the habitat for invertebrates. So there's all these different advantages, and there's all these different impacts that trees or lack of trees have on a river. And I think I'll stop there for the point.
I'm loving this. I'm making sort of like notes, like 1, 2, 3, 5, millions of them. When you talk about the temperature, what's that related to? Is it just because it changes the conditions where species that would naturally be there need to survive, or is it something different?
No, it absolutely is. I work for a fisheries trust, so the fish species are my primary concern. And salmon and trout are cold water species, really. They need cold water to survive. We've got a biodiversity crisis just now in Scotland, and part of that is just to do with habitat modifications, to do with rivers that have been straightened and embankments and lack of buffer zones and lack of trees. But really, the temperature difference between an area where there are trees and where there aren't can be about 4 or 5 degrees. And it's that stark. It's absolutely incredible. And that can be the difference between fish and invertebrates living or dying. And we see this in Scotland, especially in upland areas. So if you go up into Upper Aberdeenshire in the Dee, it's very very much at risk due to a lack of trees. And they can have temperatures in the upland areas of water temperatures of about 25, 26 degrees. Which can be fatal to trout and salmon.
That sounds awful. I mean, that sounds really nice for sort of like from a, oh my God, I went on holidays and this was this nice river that I can swim in, but it doesn't sound particularly lovely if you're a poor trout. So I can see how that is changing. So what should we be doing then? Just, is it about planting trees? Is it about thinking about the environment in a wider way, or is it about making sure that the trees are already there are not lost? What would you say are sort of like, if you had a magic wand and you could get 5 wishes about trees by a river, what would you ask for?
I would ask for a buffer zone on either side of the river of about 20 meters. But that's my wish list, and I know that doesn't fit in with all farms, but you asked for my wish list, so this is what you're getting.
We're getting the reality check from Russ that's laughing at this moment in like 5 seconds, so that's fine. You can wish.
Oh, Russ and I have had these conversations before. Native broadleaf trees are really important. So the species we're looking at, Russ might cover this, is willow and alder. And the advantage to alder is that the deer don't like them, so they don't tend to get browsed, whereas willow are very, very tasty to be deer and sheep and all sorts of species. There's also, I think it's in a lot of areas, there are, especially in farms, the way they were changed in the 19th century, a lot of rivers were straightened and you have embankments, and these are all very unhealthy. They affect the morphology of the river course. So I think designed buffer zones where embankments were set back from the river, trees were just allowed to naturally regenerate after some initial planting. That's one of my wish lists. And do you know what I would love to see in the future? But once the trees are established, you can allow the livestock back into these areas again. So you need to exclude them while they're growing. But I think they're so important for farms, for the livestock as well, to have cover, shade, a bit of shelter. And that would be a healthy vision, I think.
Have you had any experience of working with farmers? I mean, I'm assuming that you've had that, but just tell us about your experience working with farmers and sort of and what difference does it make, or how, like from a change perspective, how hard or how easy is it from your perspective as not a farmer? How do you bring this change about? I guess that's my question.
I think it's explaining, well, not explaining, but it's visually seeing it for themselves. Farmers see it for themselves. So the main one for a farmer is probably the loss of their soil or the loss of their land due to erosion. And we've had some big floods recently, and a lot of fields have been eroded. We've had farmers phoning me in a panic saying, my field is disappearing into my river. It's not my river, but you're talking tons and tons of soil getting lost all the time. And then you just show them, well, look at the areas where there are trees, established trees with tree roots, those haven't eroded. And then the penny drops and you think, this can be a benefit for me. So that's probably the biggest, when working with farmers, that's probably the biggest incentive for them, I would say. But I'm finding more and more farmers, and this is probably a lot of the audience tonight, more and more are becoming interested in the environment. They want to farm with the environment rather than trying to fight it. And one of the best things you can do is just set the farms back a little bit, have your riparian trees, give the river room to spread out, maybe an area where it can flood. And then there's a lot, you'll see additional benefits as well.
That sounds really interesting. I was going to ask you a couple of practical questions, but I think we'll go to Russ first, and then we can sort of like, if he doesn't answer all the questions, the practical ones, I'll come back to Craig and sort of like humiliate Russ publicly for not having had the answers. I'm really sorry, Russ. So from a practical perspective, so like Craig, thank you so much, because honestly, I don't think I've ever sat and thought about like all the benefits just in one go. And it's sort of like, it feels like a no-brainer, and it's so interesting that we're not seeing it as a no-brainer, but it's like you say, sometimes we're just not aware of it. Russ, from your perspective, what's the impact that planting trees, or why should we plant trees not only for the river but in a wider sort of like situation? Why riparian buffers?
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick intro. Yeah, if nobody, you're not all going to know who I am. My name is Russ Jobson. I work for the Tweed Forum. I used to work for the Woodland Trust for 10 years. I've done a lot with the Soil Association in the past, so I might have spoke to some of you in the past. And now I work for the Tweed Forum, and in the most basic terms, I work in the Tweed catchment, trying to increase riparian buffers or connectivity across the landscape. And 50% of my role, and the other half of my role, I try and work with people like Craig and other rivers trusts and other NGOs and landowners as well, and farmers, to try and do this at a national scale across Scotland, which links up with another national project in England and Wales. So riparian, woodlands, water, it's all on the agenda. It's coming up, and really what we're looking to try and create is, cool, clean water, give healthy, resilient river systems, and as Craig was saying, you're allowing sort of natural processes to occur. And of course, if we look at it at a landscape scale, which I appreciate, and I've worked with a lot of farmers over the years. They can some get a little focused on their own unit, which is totally understandable. Whereas we come in, we work with them within their unit areas, but we always have half an eye on the wider landscape scale, because as we know, waters run through the landscape. They're like for want of better terminology, forgive the airy-fairiness here, but they are like the lifeblood that runs through the environment. Everything needs water to survive, and currently, unfortunately, across the UK, our water quality is pretty dreadful, to be honest, on most of our river systems. So we need to try and improve that, and we can do that as an initial hit using the rivers and the tributaries thereof, and increasing our riparian planting. Craig was saying he would like 20 meters either side. I would have wished for about 400 meters either side.
Oh my God, you're not allowed to come anymore, people.
But the reality is we have to work with the landowners, and landowners have a they have a business unit, and we have to be able to work with them, blend it in with their business, give them something that's not only beneficial to them, and they can build in with their business models, whatever that may be. And there are various types across Scotland, from the larger landowner estates, down to the farmers, to the smallholders and the crofters thereof. There's a wide range in different uses of the land, and we're just trying to blend in where we can to improve water quality and the like. And rivers and riparian strips give that. So ecological islands that run through the landscape that don't care too much about borders and boundaries and march boundaries. And, if we know what's going on, and we can do some well-placed, targeted, right trees in the right place, then we can increase that ecological linkage across the landscape. And by default, we're then working at more of a landscape scale, and we can work with the landowners, trying to lose some of the issues. So some of the things that I get approached for is, maybe they've had, SEPA's maybe been knocking at the door, and they might have some runoff issues, or they might have sediment runoff, or, they've had flooding issues in the past, and they're looking for solutions to try and reduce erosion or to stop or either to reconnect maybe the floodplain, you know, because they can see the benefits of it, and we'll go in and work with them, work out where we can put trees. As I say, it's the right trees in the right place, but at the same time, and always looking at what is their business, how can we integrate into their business, what benefits can we bring in? Because a lot of the time, you know, we can bring in things like, if we can get the width, if we can get the distance to make the riparian areas financially attractive under the various funding streams that are there, the model that we work on is basically to deliver that at a cash neutral position on the ground, do all the planning for them, the fencing, all of that. We deliver that on the ground at a cash neutral position, or as best as we can. And currently, right now, there's a lot of funds out there that we can work with to do that. But it's also looking at the cross benefits. So it might be a shelter belt. It might allow them to get their sheep out of the sheds maybe 1 or 2 weeks early. It stops the inputs going in, you know, which reduces their cost things. If it's cattle farmers, quite often they would much prefer to calf outdoors. But obviously, exposure, your wind, and all the rest of it, you know, can have a negative effect on young beasts when they come out. So if we can put in some shelter belts at the same time whilst buffering a watercourse, then, you know, we're a win-win. They're reducing on their inputs, they're getting healthier calves, or they're getting the sheep out of the sheds quicker. You know, it's a win-win for everybody. And also, that might be at the bottom of a hill, say, where they've got runoff come out from their sheds or something like that, you know, and SEPA's been knocking at the door. We'll try and work with them to identify areas like that. Just going back to what Craig was saying, you know, we always do look at places where maybe there has been heavy modification done to the river, you know, straightened up, and flood embankments put in place. And, you know, we will always look at that. We'll speak to the landowners, and sometimes the landowners are, it's just a no, that's fine. We'll do what we can with them. Other ones, you know, we know, certainly here in the Tweed catchment, we've done a lot. We've been working with them. We're opening up flood areas. You know, we're allowing the floodplain to reconnect, you know, which is slowing the flow, protecting houses down further down the line. And we're working with Dundee University and a few others, and we've got a lot of good science starting to come up, well, a lot of good data showing that what we're doing with green engineering, which is riparian woodlands, ponds and scrapes, leaky barriers, providing that ecological linkage at a landscape scale, is starting to have a very positive effect in the Eddleston catchment, specifically where we're doing a lot of work in reducing the peak flows, or reducing the lag times, increasing the lag times for high flows coming off after a rainfall event by anything from 2 to 3 hours, but, you know, sometimes a lot more. And it's not going to stop the flooding per se all the time, but it does give people a few more hours to lift the gear off the floor, get it upstairs, so we can reduce flooding from there. In lesser cases, it will stop that flooding from happening, and generally the flooding's happening because the water's coming down and hitting a man-made object like a bridge, parapet, or something where it's been channeled and we have disconnected it from the floodplain. It's got nowhere to go, so when it comes up, it's got to go somewhere, and that's generally people's houses, unfortunately. So we do a lot of work around that, and the whole, you know, as I say all the time, we have that wider eye on the much larger landscape scale intervention, and that's obviously, if you do that, you can connect into other funding pots, and we work with a number of landowners to do that. And as I said, my other role is basically upskilling rivers trusts and NGOs and landowners across Scotland. We're just rolling that out at the moment. We're just starting the initial phases of upskilling people to do this, understand where the people are to speak to, where the funds are to bring them in, and you know, try and make them achieve something that works for everybody.
So imagine you're a farmer, you've listened to Craig and Russ, you're absolutely convinced of the benefits, you're desperate to consider it for your farm, and you have no idea how and where and how do you even start. Colleen's making a good point there about sort of like online resources, which we can ask later. And Till's also asking, like, what size of rivers are we talking about? So could you give us a flavor about, just imagine you're a regular farmer, you have no idea, you may have a wee burn or a big river close by. How do you go about making it happen?
Yeah, I'll break that down into the questions there. I mean, what size of rivers? From a temperature perspective, which is the big driver at the moment, wild salmon are on the decline. As Craig said, you know, high water temperatures. We've already got one case of fish loss in the north, and we're currently working with them. They've just employed a woodland or a climate resilience officer, who's going to be working with the estates who we've already approached, and they're all keen to aid with tree planting. Generally, from a multiple benefit perspective, we're concentrating more on the headwaters, and that's due to if we can cool the waters further up, then the cooler water comes down through the system. It's harder to cool the water once it's in the main stem, especially on the bigger rivers. So we cool the water further up, and that's where the heating's occurring. Especially, ironically, most people probably won't know this, but you'd expect the higher water temperature to be in the south of the country, but they're actually in the north. That's due to the fact that there's no trees there, and there's a shallower substrate, and that some of the geology up there, the rock form, is actually a darker colour, so it absorbs more heat, and therefore it releases it slowly through the night, and the water temperatures never get down, and then the sun's back up again, no shade. It just continues through the summer, heating the watercourse. So we are generally concentrating from a shading, from a fisheries management, from a, to try and improve salmonoid habitat. We're generally focusing more on the headwaters, and equally, that's where we need to be slowing the flow at a wider catchment scale. We need to be slowing it coming off the hills, letting it infiltrate the soils more. So that's where the majority of our work is concentrated. However, if a farmer's coming knocking on the door saying, "Can I help?" What we never knock them back. We'll always go out and give them a hand, regardless of where they are. And just picking up on the online resources.
Can I just jump in there, Russ, just very quickly about the smaller burns? They are incredibly important in an ecological point of view. And I think if you can tackle some of the smaller burns, there's a cumulative impact. So if everybody's doing it, then you will see an impact as well. So I think they're incredibly important. But obviously the main stems are the main focus at the moment when we have limited resources. Sorry, Russ.
Yeah, no, it's right. As I say, we're catching very much on the headwaters, the tributaries. That's exactly where we do a lot of our work out there for that accumulative effect. I mean, that's mostly where we're doing, because we can affect stuff coming down, and also if we can get that, the big one that people don't see is we use trees a lot to stop negative sediment impact, but actually trees provide significant positive sediment, drop, nutrient drop, also dead animals. It's all about bringing up the phosphate levels, which are diluted. Our landscapes are actually pretty clean. We don't leave dead animals on there anymore. People don't like to say it, but actually we're reducing the actual positive nutrients that could be going in. And I know a lot of the bigger estates now are starting to leave dead carcasses in very specific places out the road, just in the little nooks and crannies, which is fantastic, because you get the actual positive nutrients entering the system, which helps the salmonoids and all the invertebrates within there. In terms of an online resource, there is information out there as part of the larger project that I work on. I have 50% of my roles in the Tweed catchment, 50% under a project which is a Scottish Wildlife Trust initiative-led project called Riverwoods. And as part of that, which is what I do, upskilling across the country and trying to engage and get more riparian trees in the ground, we will be producing a hub, if you like, for want of a better expression, where we're going to draw in a lot of case studies, a lot of the science, a lot of mapping, so people can go on and see what quality the rivers are, what is it in a high water temperature area, potential, and all the rest of it. And that's going to be like, there's going to be like a hub of excellence there, if you like, and it's going to all be open source, so anyone can get on, have a look at it, and that will be coming on stream at some point in the future. I'll be, to be brutally honest, in time scales, we're probably looking at, something along the lines of 12 to 24 months to get all that drawn together and make it, because we've got to check a lot of the stuff that goes out there. In the meantime, there is articles out there, there's good resources people can go and speak to, be that, at your local Rivers Trust, Craig, or, the ones on most of the Scotland has a Rivers Trust or a Rivers Trust body. If they can't help you, they will generally know the people who can, or you'll get passed down the line to somebody like myself who will more than happy to help. There are other, ENGOs out there. There are agents, people who get paid to do this. And then of course there's the likes of yourselves, a lot of, setups like yourselves doing these online events and, walk and talk events, which I've done a lot with yourself in the past, with Lynn, who I think's on the call somewhere as well, all great stuff to get out there and find some stuff. One document I do use a lot, I know I'll hold my hand up here, I worked for the Woodland Trust for years, but they have a document called the Pont Bren. If you can look it up online, I don't know if I've got a link for it. Very good document. I always just think it's written by farmers for farmers. It just gives a very good overview of using riparian buffers, water quality, and the rest of I'll see if I can find a link. I won't have it today unless somebody else has got it, but I can forward that on to you. You know, it's a very good just document for landowners and farmers to read. It's one I always push. It's been out for years, but it's still a very good document.
So imagine again, that makes an awful lot of sense. You've read this thing. How would you suggest a farmer can go about it? Would he have to call you? Do you think it's better if they go and talk to the Woodland Trust? Is it something that they should be doing on parallel on different levels? Or is there one place where you think, well, this is sort of like the right place to start conversations, going to see things? What would you say is the tool that you've seen that works the most if you want to get started and make it happen?
I mean, we get approached in the Tweed Forum role here. You know, farmers, landowners, they just ring us direct. They know what we do and been at it for 20 years. They just want to get engaged, and they've decided they want to do something. They know we're probably the best or the most suitable people to speak to in the first instance, and then generally we'll just go out and help them. There are multiple options to deliver this work on the ground currently. I mean, the main one that we try to access, if we can get the space, because it all comes down to finance, we have to make it financially attractive to the landowner, and we have to, you know, utilize funds that are available. We will always try and utilize the forestry grant system. That's the, you know, publicly funded grant system, and we blend finance with that. So we will try and get a scheme that's applicable, because there is, you know, there are caveats around what is applicable and what isn't within the forestry grant scheme. And then we will work out what we can do, get the area, we work up the schemes, and we deliver that for the landowner. So that's one route through. They can speak to the Rivers Trust, they could speak to the Forestry Commission, and as I say, they could go out and speak to a number of other bodies. There's more money coming into the environment now than there probably ever has been for a while, but it's coming in through multiple sources, and not always the ones that you may see. For instance, flood alleviation schemes putting in £80 million worth of hardscape within a town, say, doesn't sound like you can get some trees out of it, but it may be that somebody like the Rivers Trust or a local community body has taken a chunk of that money, because they have to do that under the planning guidance, and has it to spend on green engineering, which then a farmer can maybe tap into. Or it may be that we would tap into it, bring in the FGS, blend all that finance together. I mean, I'm not mentioning carbon because that's a whole other subject, but carbon monies are out there to make things work, which we can, if we have the scale to deliver it, and we have the hectarage to make it applicable, you know, carbon can make things very, for want of a better word, profitable for landowners if they have the scale to go at a smaller scale. If it's not applicable for, you know, like FGS or forestry grant scheme monies or something, there are other routes around it. In the south of Scotland, there's the South of Scotland tree planting scheme. Woodland Trust have a couple of schemes that, you know, they have more hedges, they have more woods that can get out there and deliver stuff. Other organisations, Future Woods is another one that's going about offering this at the moment. You know, there are always limits to all these schemes, and some will work, some won't, but there's a lot out there to make it happen. The main one, I think, from a landowner's perspective, the main point to remember is that if you're not utilising a publicly funded scheme, i.e. the forestry grant scheme, then your basic payment may not be eligible once you put it under trees, depending on what scheme you go for. So it's one of the points that gets lost. Under an FGS scheme, if you put 10 hectares under trees, you get your basic payment for the length of that scheme, which is 20 years. If you were to do that under a scheme, say, from another position that's not through that publicly funded way, not through an EEC scheme or not through the forestry grant scheme, then you may have to say that land is ineligible, so you may lose your basic payments. And this is what, you know, you need to work through with the landowner. You know, it's about understanding their business, about showing them very open and transparent budget sheets and working out how to fit that in with their business.
Here's a question that I didn't ask from Craig, and I think I'll ask you, both of you now. Is there a situation where you shouldn't be planting trees by rivers, or when should you consider avoiding riparian buffers? Because it sounds, again, I know that I get really excited about those things. So all of a sudden I'm like, yes, let's plant trees absolutely everywhere. And then sometimes you really need to be careful with this kind of like black and white approaches. So is there a situation that you would think maybe not so much, or definitely you need to double check before doing anything?
I can think of one that we have in Angus and Glen Clover, and it could be to do with wading birds. So having trees next to wading birds can put wading birds off. They don't like being overlooked directly. So you don't want to plant trees in that area. I think obviously fish are the most important consideration for everything. And I'm struggling to think of a situation where trees wouldn't benefit fish. You might not want to plant trees in areas that flood a lot because you would lose them if you have a good flow of water. Russ?
Yeah, there is definitely, yeah. I mean, going back to my first point, what we've been saying throughout, you've got to get the right trees in the right place, and that's vital. You've got to get that in. So, I mean, taking Craig's point there in floodplains, yeah, it can be tricky getting them in, but that might be actually a place you may, if it was part of a fully modelled natural flood management and hardscape or intervention scheme. There is places you might want to put in. Is difficult, but in terms of where you might not want to plant them, yeah, absolutely. Deep peat is a no-no. So I mean, I think the current guidance, I've got a feeling they've just reduced. I might be wrong. I think they reduced it to 20 or 30 centimeters. But basically, we work on the principle that any peat's too much peat, so we don't plant on peat. That brings its own problems in other areas in the north. I did a big scoping plan over many thousands of hectares, full of peat. Absolutely crying out for trees. They're losing fish in the burn, but it's pretty much peat all the way to the edges. Then where the rivers move naturally, you can actually plant trees, but of course that brings in the other conflict, which is deer, which is the best grazing land, and the fact that the thinner areas don't work under the current grant scheme. So we can't actually get anything in there under the current grant scheme that makes it financially viable. But deep peat is a no-no. That we do a lot of peat restoration as well, blocking grips, re-wetting areas. So peat's definitely one of them. As Craig said, specific habitats might come in. That might be wader habitat. It also might be like species-rich grassland, or it could be something like a water meadow. You wouldn't want to plant there. There's no point planting a load of trees to create one habitat if you've already got a really fantastic habitat there. But to be brutally honest, a lot of the land we look at is quite heavily improved ground. It's been grazed for many years. There's no real substance to it in terms of ecological value quite often. But that's part of when you get somebody, by employing somebody who knows what they're doing, when you go through the process before you plant trees. I mean, we go out, we do all our checks. We'll be online before we go out, checking all the normal positions for triple SIs, for wader habitat, for deep peat. We'll be checking our soils, we're checking all the designation areas. That's before we're even on the ground. That's just the basic checks. Then we get on the ground, we do the visual checks. Then it goes, if you're going through FGS, it'll go through a process anyhow. So all the main players will get to feed into that. So at any point in that road, if somebody's got a problem, they will raise it, and then you can meet, you can discuss, you can find routes around it. Or it may be that they raise serious objections and you either give up, or the woodland officer who may decide the grant will decide one way or the other. But generally, I'm always trying to blend everything in together. There's no point being in conflict or taking a good habitat out to replace it with another one. There's just no point to that. There's plenty of room to go at. Essentially there's plenty of room to go at. There's always conflict with land use, but there is lots of room to go at. But they're some of the things that we're looking at. And if we're on that from species risk grassland deep peat, it's just like, well, okay, we can plant these little areas, but we're going to have to find another way to do it, because probably the scale we're looking at isn't going to fit with the current bigger funding schemes.
That sounds brilliant. I think that it's been very, very thorough overall, but people, this is your chance, your time to ask any questions that you may have. If you're really tired, we won't take offense to you wanting to end things, but we have a few questions so we can get started. People, if you want to ask the questions via the chat, that's great. If you want to raise your hand, that's an option as well. So we're going to start with the questions that I have in my secret document here. And the first question is actually for Helen. It's all about sort of planting by yourself. Would you recommend doing it, or was it sort of like an experience that you had and that you never want to look back at?
It was hard work, but I think possibly leading on to another question that was there, or maybe from it, it worked best if you could work in twos. So one plant and one put the stakes and the guards on, and that worked much better than actually trying to do that and then go back for more trees and go back for more stakes and go back for more things. but I mean, compared to some of the schemes we've been listening about, I think our our hedges and woodlands were quite small beer.
Well, that's the thing. You need to plant small and big and all kind of sizes for it to work, because otherwise you end up just creating little pockets. That's the whole point, isn't it? Just creating the connection from the hedge all the way to the riparian buffer, and then up, and then it kind of makes sense for biodiversity. Torquil, what would you say? How would you recommend people try to find out more about hedge laying? That's another question. Where would you, other than the hedge laying association, would you suggest that the best way forward is just testing it, like going out and doing it, or is it visiting someone else's hedges? How would you say is the best way to learn a little bit more about it from a practical perspective?
Well, I think probably, to be honest, I'd refer them back to the National Hedgeling Society, but they have videos, they have a list of where their training is going on. There's not that much up in Scotland, to be honest. If people are really interested, they can get in contact with me. If there was enough people who wanted to do a workshop, I don't do a lot of workshops, but if I get strong-armed into it, I probably would do it. But other than that, probably the National Hedgeling Society. Yeah.
A question just came in for you as well, so we're going to just address it since we have your attention. How concerned should Chris be about the damp in Scotland causing disease in the base of pleaches? Is that a thing, or how are the Scottish conditions particularly good or bad for particular ways of hedging, I guess, as well, in a wider scheme, I mean, in a wider sense? I'm
not sure I understand the question, to be honest.
Repeating like a parrot.
Chris,
do you want to raise your hand?
The conditions in Scotland are totally fine. It's having the enthusiasm of landowners to embrace hedge laying is what is required for farmers and for estates to actually put stuff into the land as opposed to just taking from the land. And if you have that enthusiasm to do that, then we'll get more hedges. But I don't think the conditions are any different in Scotland to anywhere else in terms of the actual hedges. There's just not enough of them. That's the problem. Too many have been taken out.
Makes sense. Chris eventually will try to get the connection. Otherwise, Chris, I swear, will try to make either sense of the question, or I'll attack Torquil afterwards and sort of like ask about it in more detail. But we'll answer your question. Absolutely. Let me see. Let me go through the whole questions. There was a final question, but it's more about. Let me find it. Where is it? Oh, I can't find it. I lost it. Anyways, there was a question about whether there's particular trees that you should not consider on riparian buffers that can actually have an impact on animals, whether it's because they're not local, or like pine trees, for example, if there's particular trees that can change the pH. Maybe, you know, how sometimes we worry about the soil. Is that something that's similar for the water? So Craig, I think this question would be for.
I'll pass it to Russ.
That was very smooth. I'll give you a point.
No problem at all. So you just repeat that. Is there trees that we shouldn't be planting in the riparian zone? Is that the question?
Yeah, exactly. Are there any trees that could change sort of like the conditions of the water, or for whatever reason are not suitable?
Yeah, I mean, in the 99.9% of the time, we work well within the native sphere. We will only plant the right trees in the right place. So as Craig said, generally we work in that sphere in the wetland habitats. It'll be the willows, it'll be the alders, and there'll be the birch in there, the downy birch in there, and then, you know, we'll push out to some larger species like some oaks if we can get them in the slightly drier areas. I mean, you can plant. You don't want a riparian area 100% covered. Now, we all know areas of river where it's on both sides, but if you look at the catchment as a whole, which is why I keep coming back to saying we need to keep an eye on the catchment as a whole, you know, 100% cover area of a few hundred meters, if the rest of it's wide open, is no bother at all. But generally, if we're doing larger scale riparian stuff, then we generally work on a 50-60% tree cover to 40% open ground. You know, and then if we have the space, we will try and place the trees where we think they'll get the most benefit, looking at the aspect of the sun, looking at the geology of the hills, and the aspect of the hills to the river, to the shade, you know, because you can plant the right tree, you can plant trees in a place and they might not do anything because they're protected by a hill. So you're trying to look at all that when you come into a design. The problem we currently have with that is that if we want to access the grant funds, they're not always, they don't always tie in with the most ideal design. So it's always going to be about compromise at the moment. We always have to compromise maybe the amount of trees we plant to access the funds to make it attractive to the landowner. Going forward into 2024 and beyond, when whatever comes down the line to replace it, or I don't suspect we'll get much change per se in the general scheme, but I would hope that water quality and water improvement will get an uplift, so there'll be more money to do it, and we'll get the flexibility to design the scheme to enable that to the best of our ability. That's what we're hoping for. So there's always compromise, but it's always compromise working with the landowners, because, you know, what I would look at and go, let's go for it, you're not going to get, because they've got a whole business to run, and we have to blend that in with their business needs.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I think one of the major no-nos would be Sitka spruce. They have very shallow roots. They do change the pH, and they're a non-native tree. But we've done riparian tree planting with Scots pine in the Angus esques, and that's been very successful. I was quite surprised actually. But so yeah, it could be a pine if it's a native pine. But Sitka spruce would be the no-no.
Are there any left standing in Angus?
Yes, yeah, there's a couple. I've seen them both.
Chris managed to unmute himself. So Chris, if you want to ask Torquil, I'm really sorry about being so rubbish at asking that question. Feel free to go. Is Chris hand up?
I don't think I can. My connection's so awful.
You're managing. We could get you through for a second there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was just all the hedge laying I've done's been down sort of Somerset way, and I was worried coming up here in the damp conditions with the extra wet and you know, some of the hedges that I'm doing, they're just never drying out, and the water's running down along the pleach and into the base. Whether there's going to be any risk of that enhancing the susceptibility of the cuts to disease.
No, I don't think so, Chris. Especially hawthorn, and they're very resilient plants. It's quite, once they're established, it's quite hard. And I don't know that many diseases that hit hawthorn, to be honest. But no, I've never had any issues with that. It all seems quite
super. I mean, it's a range of species I'm doing.
It's always handy when you do your pleach, and you've got the wee bit of a stump, is just to put a wee bit of an angle on the cut. Yeah. And that allows the water.
Yeah, I do that.
It can still come down into the root, but it should be fine, to be honest.
Fine. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing as well. And the other question, I've not done much beech in the past. Do you find that beech takes longer to regenerate once it's been laid?
Yeah, with beech you have to. Yeah, there's a Scottish Championship down in Jedburgh where they were laying beech. I tend, when I lay beech, I tend to leave, not cut as much off as I would with hawthorn or blackthorn. You can be quite brutal, but I tend to be a bit more with both holly and with beech. Try and leave as much of the brash on as possible, if in keeping with the hedge, because you're right.
Okay.
It's slower.
Russ, I'm thinking that the hedges are probably calling you to answer something.
Yeah.
You raise your hand. I'm not sure if that's because you want to answer something.
It wasn't to do with that. I just wanted to clarify something else at some point. I wasn't going to spin on the hedges there. I'm fascinated by the hedging talk. It's great.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. But were you raising your hand to clarify something else?
It was just a question that come up. Well, sort of a point in the chat. Two things. One, I mentioned the Pontbren document, and Virginia is online, I believe, and she's put that up, which is great. Thank you, Virginia. She also mentioned that it's a good point, and one I've just actually ran into in the last week, about the minimum planting size. That you can go down to a 50-metre size and a 0.25 of a hectare. That's the minimum size that's applicable under the FGS, which is absolutely correct. if you try and make a scheme work at their minimum levels, it's very difficult to make the finance stack up, and probably at a smaller level you wouldn't do it. However, a case in point that run into just the other day, I was out on site. Farmer's got problems with erosion, but he lives up in the hill land. It's his best spring grazing, so it's very valuable to him in terms of his sheep. Doesn't want to give up that much land. I can't make the scheme financially viable under anything. And then we got talking, and I kind of knew that in my head, but then we got talking, and then he sort of said, well, I've actually got a 7 hectare block of land over here that I don't use for anything, and actually I wouldn't mind putting trees on it. And because we then could work that larger block, we can then add in all the smaller ones because we have the large one, making it more financially attractive. And then we got the smaller blocks. We're now working up all the smaller blocks that I couldn't make work before, because somewhere else, not necessarily bang on the river, but just on the side of the hill, which will still be, beneficial, native woodland, provides a bit of linkage. But because we got that big area, we can then bring the smaller, take things down to the minimum size and make it attractive. It's just a point, if people are looking at thinking, well, I don't need to go 50 meters, that's the minimum we can go down to, if you like, but we need width and we need scale to make the finances generally stack up in the most things. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that you give the scale direct to the river. If you have a bit of land offset somewhere else, we can then make things work on the river at a smaller scale and make it all stack up for you. It's just a point that we run into from time to time, and I've just been out 2 days ago having a look at that exact scenario.
That sounds brilliant. I think that we're getting to the end of today. So unless someone has an absolutely pressing question that they're desperate to ask, I really, 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 really want to thank you all. I think it's been really interesting to see sort of like all these different topics coming to the idea of strips of trees, which sometimes is sort of like, it's hard to think how complex it is and how many things you have to think about. So thank you so much for all the information that you've shared. We're definitely going to be sharing all the resources that we've talked about, but also contact information, some more information on the grants that are out there, more information on hedge laying, courses coming. If someone's desperate to go up to Mull, we'll make sure to avoid letting you know where Helen is, because otherwise she's going to be crammed with people knocking on her door to go and see hedges, but we can share the pictures. And so thank you everyone so much. If you have any questions, please let us know. Just for you to know, there's 2 more events on agroforestry coming, and it's going to be the first week and the second week of March, and they're going to focus more about what products can you get from trees in your land and why trees can help you improve your profitability overall. So this was sort of like the more, I guess the less profitability oriented one, but it's been super, super interesting. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Helen.